10 years couldn't bring them together. Until one winter afternoon, everything that had been silent and separate began to move. Evan Brooks lived his mornings like someone practicing a prayer he wasn't sure anyone would hear. The kettle hissed awake before the sun. He lined out socks that were a little too thin for the coming cold, checked the battered leather wallet where he kept a single photograph folded flat between receipts, and he ran a thumb over a small square of paper taped inside his apartment door, a child's crayon drawing of two stick figures beneath a lopsided house. In a child's careful block letters, someone had written, "Dad." The paper had yellowed at the edges, the glue had given up and the corner curled, but Evan never removed it. He liked the way it caught the light when he left, like a promise left on the threshold. There were mornings he still heard the echo of another household, laughter from a place that used to be his. Those memories arrived without warning. A football in the yard, the way the boy had insisted on sleeping with a book open at his chest, the sound of an unfinished joke. Those sounds existed now in fragments, and sometimes Evan held them up to the present as if checking whether the grain matched. Mostly he cataloged the absence in small practical ways. One less bowl in the cabinet, a darkened space on the mantel where a school picture might have been. No family portrait showed the decade. The photograph in his wallet was a half relic, a blurry shot of a little boy with an uneven toothy grin, taken 10 winters ago on a hill dusted with snow. Noah, the caption read on the back, in a hand that could have belonged to anyone willing to keep a labeled memory. Evan kept that label like an ache, defined, contained, and impossible to smudge away. He worked 2 jobs. Daylight belonged to the delivery van and the routes he knew down to the broken stoplight and the woman who always shoved $1 in his hand for being on time. Nights he held a fluorescent-lit desk at a small security firm for a midtown retail complex. More eyes than people, more duty than pay. The jobs left him tired in a way that wasn't merely physical. Fatigue rested under his ribs like a slow companion, attentive and constant. He accepted it because it kept the bills paid, because discipline gave him a structure he could put trust in, and because to stop would be to notice the threads of another life fraying. He owned a jacket that had lived more of his life than he had. It was a hand-me-down from a friend who said, "It's time you had something decent," and so Evan kept it like a talisman. It smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar. In the inside pocket, wrapped in a motel napkin so many times it looked like a tiny parcel, were voicemail prints, tiny snippets he had saved on his phone, a child's breathless laugh from a birthday, a voice asking if he'd read a school assignment, and an "I miss you," delivered at a distance. He listened to them the rare nights when sleep would not come, not because he wanted to relive the past, but because the voices were proof he'd once been present, and he feared forgetting the precise timbre of the boy's name. The cause of their separation fit into Evan's memory the way a photograph sometimes fades at the edges, clear in its core, sketchy around the frame. It was accurate enough for him to carry the shame without parsing it in public, but not so neat that he could hand it to someone else and expect them to accept it at face value. For the purposes of what would come later, it helps to note that the reasons were not strangers to hardship. The exact legal and personal details are indefinito, left intentionally vague here, because different versions of the past can feel true. Possible outlines included a court-ordered custody decision after a complicated breakup, a period when Evan's life was disrupted by addiction and recovery, during which the boy was placed with his mother or another relative, a stretch of incarceration for a mistake that turned years into a measurably different life. Each version carried the same basic cost, a young father who loved his son and found himself on the wrong side of a calendar. Whichever of those was the precise truth, the effect remained. 10 years measured not only in time, but in distance, in silence returned as routine. That distance shaped Evan. It taught him to be small and steady. It taught him to be patient enough to survive. He did what fathers do when they can't be with their children in the ways they'd intended. He kept proof. The crayon drawing on the door, the photograph, the voicemail fragment. He also kept a list of places he'd looked for opportunities to cross paths, school events, community outreach programs, sports leagues. Most of those places were like islands he never reached. He'd gone to the occasional school fair once and watched a taller boy with a familiar tilt in his walk and convinced himself it was wishful thinking. That kind of hope sat heavy in him, a small and persistent lamp. The holiday market on Spruce Street grew every year into a patchwork of lights and booths. The scent of roasted chestnuts mixed with warm pastries and the metallic tang of the old Ferris wheel that had become a landmark. Evan knew the market's cadence, families clustering under string lights, couples speaking in quick intimacies, teenagers daring each other to try the spice cider. He had come there often enough in the years since the separation that the crowd felt like a possible theater of memory, somewhere the past might step forward.
On the day that would begin a chain of events neither he nor anyone else could have predicted, he was on security duty for a local store contracted to the market. His night job had been flexible, and the extra hours paid for an oil change. He took the midday shift because it put him in place among people.
During the lull before the holiday rush, he stood by the information kiosk, rubbing his hands against each other to warm them, watching a little girl in a bright scarf spin under the lights. He thought of Noah and how, at that age, the boy had loved to spin until his face blurred into joy. He felt the old, silly urge to reach out and steady that small figure. Crowds are a different kind of intimacy. You can walk past strangers and feel their lives like a faint warmth. You can be anonymous in a way that both comforts and isolates. The market swelled in the afternoon, voices layered over voices. The street performers turned their tricks under the evergreen canopies. Evan's radio crackled with routine calls, lost items, directions, a minor dispute at booth 5. He answered with clipped professionalism, because his job, for many years, had been to carry responsibility without making people uncomfortable with it. The sound that cut through the hum was sudden and wrong, not like the polite murmur of the crowd, but a sharp metallic report, followed by a higher-pitched pop, and then the staccato of people breaking forward and running. It began at the food court, a small cluster of stalls where parents had been unwrapping scarves and feeding fries to children. Panic doesn't arrive as cinematic clarity. It arrives as a scattering of senses. The smell of smoke, paper whipping in the air, bodies folding toward exits, the urgent low commands of staff who had no plan but to move. Evan moved the way instinct had taught him, without deliberation. He saw a child stumble beneath a falling stall canopy, the child's small hand twisting as she tried to rise. His feet found the wooden crate in a step he didn't account for, and he dove, not toward the sound necessarily, but toward the liveliness of being human in immediate crisis. He caught the child under his arm, felt the small frame tremble, and drew himself between her and whatever had caused the chaos. Someone shouted, someone else screamed. The world refracted into a handful of images. A mother falling to her knees, a child's shoe spinning off into the gutter, a scarf snagged on a skewed nail. He heard a distinct cracking under his own weight, felt heat flare in his shoulder, and then the noise multiplied into something elemental. People calling, a child's wail, the sharp hiss of a security alert. He didn't think of consequence. He thought of the weight of a small body and the trajectory of danger. He didn't calculate whether he was making himself a target. He only moved to make sure a child, someone's child, was not harmed. Paramedics were there fast, faster than anything Evan could have expected. Someone, maybe a passerby, maybe a vendor, had already dialed. He tasted copper on the back of his tongue, felt the adrenaline and the slow lowering of his knees as someone lifted the child from him. He let go willingly, with a single stray thought that he couldn't stop the ringing in his ears.
The child was bundled into an adult's arms and clung to her rescuer with a wayward trust only children possess. The crowd surged and parted like a river around them. What a camera sees in that chaos is one thing. What it later broadcasts is another. There was a phone recording, as there always is now, the quick, shaky footage from someone who had been too close or too curious. In that clip, a figure appears blocking movement, moving between bodies. In the minute and a half before that camera cuts away and stumbles back to the food stalls, several frames might suggest heroism. Others, cropped and sped, were susceptible to different readings. The nature of a single second on a phone can be a multiple-choice test for interpretation. Evan felt the heat of embarrassment more than the hint of injury at first. He was whisked toward the folding chairs behind the community tent as volunteers grabbed blankets. His arm throbbed where something had grazed muscle. A paramedic asked him questions with professional brevity. Name, age, any allergies. He said his name and felt like an answer to a question no one really asked. He told them, "I'm fine," though the paramedic shook his head and said, "Let's check the shoulder." They pressed a small pack of gauze to a cut and bandaged it with competent hands. A volunteer wrapped a fleece around the child's shoulders and, with the calm authority born of handling small emergencies, asked about parents. "She's with her mother," someone answered, and in the next breath a woman in a black coat rushed forward, eyes wide. Someone caught her hand, and the child turned, pressing her face into her mother's coat. The mother, tall and clear-eyed, then looked up at Evan with half gratitude and half fierce, raw fear. She placed both hands on her child's shoulders and said his name softly, as if chanting it to himself to ensure she got it right. That woman was Leela Thornton. She moved differently than other people in the market, less accidental, more predestined.
She had learned early how to keep a posture of composure. People often mistook composure for coldness. That day, the face she turned to in the sudden quiet bore both elements, a flood of gratitude beneath the surface of her control. "Are you hurt?" she asked, voice shaking a fraction. Her daughter, tiny and stunned, peeked at Evan with curiosity, like a child deciding whether to trust someone new. Evan said he was okay. His shoulder was sore but not broken. The paramedics decided he did not need to be taken to the hospital. He walked away after exchanging a few matter-of-fact words with the authorities. He made his way back to his van and, in the cold privacy of its front seat, unwrapped the motel napkin parcel and held the voicemails in his hands. He listened to a laugh that belonged to Noah, and then, like a man surfacing from deep water, he let in the small, private pain. The video had already begun its life. Someone uploaded a clip with a caption intended for clicks. "Man uses child as shield. Look what he did." The clip was short, edited by someone with an eye for drama. A few frames where Evan had stepped forward were slowed. A reaction shot, someone shouting something indistinct, was repeated. The headline beneath offered a tidy narrative that needed nothing more than confirmation. Within hours, the clip spread to a feed in the city, and then farther. The market had its own gossip loops. People who had been there retold their versions. Those versions first asked for a label: hero, villain, frantic stranger. Labels travel faster than nuances. Evan did not know the clip had been edited when his phone lit up with messages. He was in a breakfast spot across town when his supervisor called, voice thin with the professional concern of someone who has seen a bad headline and is trying to imagine the fallout. "Evan," the supervisor said, "we're getting calls. I need you to hold tight. HR will be in touch." The words arrived like a cold front. His stomach folded. It wasn't the law court or the police that would decide his fate first. It was the public square of opinion. Employers, conscious of headlines, acted quickly. PR departments preferred caution to moral complexity. Within a day, the security firm had issued a holding statement, and then a notice, an administrative leave pending review. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a social suspension. He felt it like a personal exile. On the news feed where he tried to search his own name, the comments were a chorus of certainty and cruelty. "Looks guilty. Why isn't he in handcuffs? What a monster." There were, of course, defense lines, people who saw the raw footage and offered support, but the mechanics of outrage favored movement over careful thought. His friends texted shorter messages: "You okay? Saw the clip? This sucks, man." He answered each one with a single, small truth: "I don't know what they're saying. I was helping." The universe of social reaction began to claw at his edges. He received a terse email from his landlord: "Please be advised we will discuss your current lease at the end of the month." He felt the landlord's tone like an added weight. The nights that had been his shelter now seemed more exposed. A notice to vacate is a formal phrase. The fear it engenders is not. At home, among the thin curtains and the red kettle, Evan allowed himself to think through the possible consequences. A man in his 40s who had suffered a decade of absence would not be surprised to have his character judged by strangers, but he felt an odd newness in how it stung. Part of the pain was practical, part of it was reputational.
And part of it was the sense that history had a habit of refracting itself through other people's lenses. Someone else's edit could make his entire life look like a lie. He called Noah's number of impulse, more for the sound of a familiar voice than for expectation. The line went straight to voicemail. He left a message that was brief and quiet, the way you call someone you know is a stranger, but who once belonged to you. "Noah," he said, "it's Dad. I wanted you to hear my voice. I'm okay. I love you." He listened to the beep, to the tap of nothing, and let silence absorb him. News trucks made a brief pilgrimage to the market, their mics glinting in the winter sun. The footage shown on local channels emphasized the same tidy narrative the clickbait had: a man, a child, and the question of intent. The more compressible the story, the more likely it was to be repeated. The more it repeated, the more real it seemed. In the days that followed, Evan moved through an altered reality where private deeds lived alongside public interpretations. A neighbor avoided eye contact. A regular at the diner slid his coffee across the counter with a brief, awkward apology. Inside the Thornton circle, Lila moved with a different kind of urgency. She watched the footage in a quiet conference room at the headquarters of a family-run company that had given her both resources and a brittle armor. Her daughter, Aria, sat wrapped in a fleece, tiny fingers still sticky from a pastry. Lila's first feeling when the news clip hit her phone was not outrage at its editing. It was a suppressed, tight gratitude that a child in her care had not been harmed. She felt the rawness of a parent's gratitude shift quickly into calculation. Someone had recorded a moment. Someone had given it shape. The shape was now floating in other people's hands.
Lila was not a woman used to letting strangers decide the narrative for her family. She had learned to be strategic about perception, to think of every public image as both a mirror and a tool. She was no stranger to using resources to protect what was hers, but there was a part of her that, in the hush after the market, could not stop thinking about the man who had stepped in front of a child. His face lingered in the corner of her mind, an ordinary man in an ordinary jacket, blood on his sleeve, the sudden expression of someone who had given something away without counting. The way the clip had been edited began to bother her. She kept rewinding in slow motion, trying to find the continuity the trimmed footage lacked. There was a slice of footage later in the raw file, longer, unedited, that restated the sequence. In the raw version, the man had moved forward when the canopy had collapsed. The child had been down. He had lifted her. It was the kind of movement you made in the presence of danger because you were alive and human. That context in her hands felt clarifying, but it would take more than her conviction to change the air.
Back with the bandage and the cold, Evan felt the first real ache of being publicly misread. It wasn't just about losing a job or the possibility of being evicted. It was about what 10 years of separate living had taught him to feel when strangers decided his character, that he would be judged by a slice of time that was not his whole story. He'd known small cruelties before, custody rulings, legal notices, but the new cruelty arrived in flurries of comments and headlines. People who had never bothered to know him had offered verdicts. He wandered the city with the weight of other people's eyes. He made the rounds of small, comforting errands, the hardware store where the owner knew him by name and gave him advice about a rusted heater, the old church where a volunteer slid him a pamphlet and a quiet tea. These were small islands of human contact that required no explanation, and in them, Evan felt his edges soften. Word traveled fast. His supervisor's voicemail became a pattern. "We have to protect the company. We will review the incident." The holder of any public office, business, or school will often default to the path of least exposure. The default looked like a professional distance that felt for Evan like desertion. He moved through administrative processes with the resigned patience of someone who had learned that systems were not designed to restore dignity quickly. They were designed to manage risk. Risk meant a reactive silence. He was not a man without allies, though. A volunteer at the market, Rosa, who ran the Lost and Found booth, found him later that evening and, without fanfare, brought him a paper cup filled with hot broth. "You don't look like the kind of man who wants a fuss," she said, handing it over like a truce. Evan accepted it as he had accepted small mercies all his adult life, grateful, guardedly. Rosa's small compassion in the kindness of strangers knitted him temporarily back together. That night, the television in the corner of the pizza shop showed another take on the clip. The station had pulled the unedited footage after pressure from a viewer who'd uploaded a longer version to a local forum. But the damage had been done. The initial narrative accrued its own momentum. A few local columnists had already begun to editorialize about how quickly public assent moved from rumor to condemnation. It was a peculiar modern cruelty, an edited fragment capable of making a private truth into public shame. Evan watched the longer clip in the dim and found himself once more justified by what he had done. He replayed the scene and saw with a sudden clarity the small bracing detail he'd missed in the moment. The child's mitten, her lip cut by a shard of glass, the way she had placed her head against his chest for a count that felt like an eternity. There was his chest beneath her head. There was the way he had felt her breathing. Those were not things anyone could fabricate. They were, in his mind, incontrovertible.
Still, the world was a place where incontrovertible things occasionally needed a loud voice to be believed. He had no loud voice. He had a van, a night shift, an apartment with a crayon drawing and a voicemail archive. He had, importantly, a stubbornness that refused to allow him to be reduced to a headline. He read the comments and the editorials and thought of his son, of the neat labels other people had given him. He thought of introducing himself to Noah again years from now and having to explain that the world had decided who he was in a matter of minutes. The smear began to etch practical consequences into the next morning. The coffee shop where he had a tab asked for cash only. A landlord's voicemail suggested immediate discussions about the lease. A local business that had once contracted with his security firm called to say they'd reconsider their arrangement pending review. Each small withdrawal of trust felt like a hand at the hem of the life he had stitched together after loss. It would not be accurate to call him crushed. Evan had moved through worse and had learned to call his endurance discipline rather than stoicism. Yet there was a new weariness, the peculiar fatigue of being misread in the only area that mattered most to him, his capacity to love and protect. He found himself sitting at a bench near a church, the cold air pressing against his cheeks, and imagined the shape of a different phone call, one where Noah answered and said something light and human. The bench didn't deliver the call. Instead, his phone flashed with a string of messages from numbers he didn't recognize.
A local blogger had found his name and linked it to a rumor about a past that included alcohol problems, a rumor that thrummed with the old vocabulary of blame. Evan stared at the screen and felt the old shame try to tilt him backward. He typed a single reply in a small, measured tone. "There is more to this. I acted to protect a child. I will cooperate with any inquiry." He sent it and felt merely the small relief of having said what he could. The winter days drew on, each one a small test of the resilience the past decade had taught him. The story spread to the places that give people opinions: forums, comment threads, neighborhood pages. He learned quickly that social narratives have gravity. They draw other things into their orbit. People took the easiest explanation and made it law. The narrative was easier to sell if it contained villainy. The role of villainy sells while nuance struggles for oxygen. Evan moved through the fallout like a man navigating a thin ice field. One wrong step could send rumor through his life in ways that made everyday survival more difficult. But he also moved like a man with a stubborn core. He called the security firm to request a copy of any footage that showed the whole event. He asked Rosa if she could collect statements from people who had been there.
He sent emails asking for the raw footage that might show his action in context. He was not naive. He knew the world often preferred the bite-sized story. But he also knew that proof, like meaning, sometimes arrived in slow, patient layers. Late one afternoon, while he gathered evidence, he received a text message with a photograph attached. It was the crayon drawing on his door, snapped by a neighbor who knew him and who wanted him to know she'd seen it. The caption read, "People like you matter." The small kindness landed like a warm coin. The city remained a study in contrasts. Across town, Leela sat in her car after declining to give the news conference prepared by her PR team. The raw footage still made the rounds on her device, but she preferred not to feed public outrage with silence. Instead, she made a list. It was a list of practical resources: private hospitals, private security contractors, a trusted counselor for her daughter if needed. Among the items on the list, almost like marginalia, was a line that would, in time, be crucial. Find full footage from vendor cameras. Do not let the story compress. For now, Leela kept her distance. Her duty was to her daughter's sense of safety and to the family's reputation. But in private, she felt the tug of gratitude toward the man who had placed himself between harm and a child. Gratitude often became action, and action required clarity. Evan's calls to his supervisor produced the same corporate syllable: review. He slept badly. He replayed the market footage in his head and turned his personal life into a catalog of things he needed to safeguard: the crayon drawing, the voicemail, the jacket. He held on to the jacket and wore it to work, more as a comfort than as a shield. It had become a garment that had absorbed more of his life than warmth. A week later, a notice came in the mail, a preliminary letter from the security firm citing ongoing review of conduct. The language was clinical, intended to be neutral. It was also a notice that the life he had stitched together might fray. He folded the letter carefully, as if folding away a map of possibilities and choosing the route of patience. In the evenings, when the city quieted around him, Evan would walk to the park and look up at the lights hung like reluctant stars in telephone lines. Children he did not know ran past him with gloves and rosy cheeks. Parents called out to them in voices that held both admonition and amusement. He watched one father call a child by a nickname, the easy possession of the title Dad spilling into the cold. He imagined his own reunion, imagined it not like the triumphant sweeping scenes you find in movies, but as a small, imperfect conversation over a chipped mug, a wary half-hug, a long, awkward hour of bridging distance. The idea of it kept him both raw and steady. As the second week passed, the clip that had initially misrepresented him still circled. Each new repost added its own narrative footnote. Some were tentative. We might be missing context. Others were sure. He was aggressive. The tide of public opinion ebbed and bobbed around firm facts. In a world where footage could be trimmed for outrage, the truth relied on witnesses, on unedited tapes, on someone with the will and the platform to say plainly what had happened. Evan could have retreated. He could have folded his jacket into his locker at the Vanguard and stopped answering his phone. He resisted that urge. Instead, he kept his routine. He asked the vendor at the market if anyone had kept tapes, if the food court security cameras might have a broader angle. He made a small list of contacts who might help. It was a ragged, tedious work, less heroic than it sounded. It was the kind of work that takes place away from cameras. Emails, polite queries, a neighbor's memory transcribed into a statement. When the first reporter called, it was with thin politeness and an appetite for drama.
Evan answered in a voice that was measured and careful. He said simply, "I did what anyone should do. I saw a child in danger. I moved." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for pity. He stated the truth as plainly as he could. The reporter asked if he had any proof. He said he was trying to gather it. After the call, he sat with the small, familiar sting of vulnerability. In a world that cycles through outrage, it is not confidence that rescues you, but corroboration. Days folded into one another. The winter moved colder. He found a flyer for a community Christmas event pinned to the bulletin board at the grocery store. Carols, a tree lighting, volunteers handing out gloves. Someone had scrawled the word Noah on it in a shaky hand. Someone else's hope, someone else's postscript. Evan looked at the word and felt the horizon tilt. He was not destined to be contained by a headline. The next move in the city's story would come from people who had watched differently, who had a longer view. But that longer view had not yet arrived. For now, the clip spun, and the small collapse of his ordinary life continued to unspool in small, practical ways. The winter market had introduced him to fate's crooked path. One moment of instinct, the next a storm of interpretation. That night, as he taped another layer of heat wrap around his shoulder and warmed his hands against a cup of coffee, he thought of small rituals that might keep him from dissolving into rumor. He left the crayon drawing on the door as if to send a quiet message to himself. Some anchors survive even when the sea grows rough. He closed the door, unplugged the kettle, and listened to the city breathe. Outside somewhere, a storefront sang "Oh Holy Night" on loop. Inside, he took out his phone and dialed a number he had not dared call in 10 years. The line went to voicemail again. He left a message a second time, voice steadier now, the words threaded with a steadier purpose.
"Noah," he said, "I don't know all the reasons why things happened the way they did, but I do know this. I'm here, and I want you to know I still love you. If or when you're ready, call me." He pressed end and let the phone sit warm in his palm. Outside his window, the market lights blinked as if answering him, patient and indifferent. In the wake of the market's chaos, a new thread began to take shape, one that would involve legal reviews and social fuss, private testimony and public statements, a wealthy mother whose gratitude might one day become something more practical than a note, and a man who had spent a decade learning how to hold weight. But those threads, tenuous as they were, had not yet woven into the warmth he prayed for. The world still needed witnesses to say there was more to the scene than the clickbait had allowed. For now, he kept to the easy, small truths: the jacket, the voicemail, the drawing on the door. He kept to the work of being ordinary and useful. He prepared in his mind for the patience the truth would require, because patience had been his teacher for 10 years, and because he had learned that if something was worth reclaiming, he had to be willing to let the season turn for it. A neighbor knocked sometime after midnight, a soft, tentative sound. A small envelope was slid under his door. Inside, a note: "We saw you. We know." The words were simple and blunt as flint. Evan read them 3 times. He placed the envelope beside his photograph and let himself, for the first time in a week, rest believing someone else had seen. The next morning, before stepping into the thin daylight, he tucked the jacket close and walked toward the van with a resolve that felt like the only reasonable thing left to do. The city's breath rose in his wake. A week of rumor and small administrative blows would not by itself undo a decade, but neither would he sit idle and allow a single edited clip to rewrite his life. As he turned the key in the ignition, his phone buzzed, a text from a number he did not recognize, raw footage. The message contained a link in one line: "You should see this." He swiped open the file and watched frames of the market he'd already lived through in a dozen private loops, the whole sequence, broader than the edited version, showing his approach and the child's fall, and, most of all, the way he had placed himself in the space between danger and that small body. For a moment, he only watched. Then, beneath the footage, a new layer of possibility began to hum. Not redemption like a sudden trumpeting reprise, but the practical kind: evidence, corroboration, the start of a counter-narrative. The next steps would require legal patience, community voices, and perhaps an unlikely ally with influence. They would also require him to reconcile with the past that had placed him apart from his son, to prepare for what a Christmas reunion might demand. For now, that footage felt like a thin bridge.
He clicked on the sender's number and saw, before he answered, the name: Rosa, the volunteer. Rosa's message arrived like a lifeline. Evan watched the raw footage on his phone in the dim light of the van's cab until the edges blurred. The clip held a wider frame than the viral edit, the canopy buckling, the child's mittens snagged on a splinter, his own feet finding the gap, the way he'd reached and rolled her into his body. It ended with a shot of the mother pulling her child close and looking at him with a gratitude so fierce it briefly took his breath. He forwarded the link to every contact he had gathered over the week, friends, the market vendor who'd lent him a blanket, Rosa herself. He sent it to the security firm and to the blogger who had asked questions. He wrote a short, steady account and attached the voicemail fragment of Noah's laughter. For the first time since the clip had gone live, he felt the future tilt towards something less hostile. The reply that mattered came in hours later in a tone Evan didn't expect, formal at first, then oddly personal. Leela Thornton had watched the raw footage. She had a platform and an instinct for control. She also had a child's hair smelling of sugar glue pressed against her coat, and a memory of the moment when a man she'd never met had put himself between harm and a small body. She called a press meeting she did not let her public relations team stage. Instead of spinning, she posted the unedited footage, a short quiet note, and a video of Arya, a child brushing on her mother's coat and speaking with the bluntness of the very young. "He saved me," Arya said simply into the phone held by her mother, little eyes steady and open. "He picked me up." Leela's note below the clip read, "Thank you isn't enough. This man put himself in harm's way to keep my daughter safe. I will see this through. If you want to know what happened, watch the whole clip." That line, clear, not theatrical, shifted things faster than Evan had dared hope. People watched Arya's face, and then the frame widened, and the ease with a small witness could outpace an edited narrative became its own kind of miracle. Comment threads that had been quick to condemn began to thicken with nuance. Local reporters, hungry for the whole story now that a person of means had asked them to look again, began requesting interviews and the raw files Rosa had shared. An online petition for a public apology began to gather signatures. For Evan, the change did not come as vindication in a single glorious moment. It came as a string of practical actions, an email from the security firm apologizing for their hurried response and offering to expedite their internal review in light of new footage, a call from a charitable clinic offering to cover his first medical checkup, a neighbor's note taped to his door that said, "We were wrong, come by for coffee."
Leela's post had not erased the bruises. It had simply allowed the city to see the fuller shape of what had happened. The day Leela visited the market to speak with the vendors, Evan was there in his ordinary jacket, hands in his pockets, barely breathing. She walked the booths, stopping at the food cart where her daughter had been eating fries. Vendors greeted her with guarded deference. Evan hung near the information table, an extra body that now had more people looking at him than before. He expected, absurdly, to feel like someone standing in a spotlight. Instead, he felt like a man at a crossroads, the ordinary instincts that had always guided him, suddenly under public view. Leela found him and did not offer a public blessing. She stood close enough to speak without drawing a crowd and said, simply, "Thank you." Her voice was low, a businesswoman's efficiency laced with a parent's gratitude. There was no flourish, no press release in the moment, just an exchange as human and small as the crayon drawing tacked to Evan's door. She asked if he was all right, then proceeded to the practical. "I asked my team to collect all the footage. We want to make sure the full story is heard. And I want to help with anything that's necessary. Medical bills, reviewing the way your employer handled this. This shouldn't be your burden alone." He wanted to decline. He wanted to be the man who stoically refused a handout. But Leela framed assistance differently. She proposed a job, not charity, a position, part-time to start, overseeing safety for several community events her company sponsored. It was the sort of offer that fit his hands, practical, with a paycheck attached, a way back into steady work. "We need people who can be calm under pressure," she said. "If you'd consider it, I'd like you to meet with our security director." The offer felt like an altar he wasn't sure he deserved to cross. Pride, and his life had taught him to be wary of strings attached to kindness. He told her he'd think about it. She smiled, then handed him a business card and something small, an envelope with a note and a number. "Call me when you're ready," she said. She did not say it as if she owned his gratitude. She said it like someone who had simply put a tool within his reach. Vindication did not arrive purely as Leela's post. It also rode on the plain testimony of several market vendors who had watched the whole sequence. They came forward with statements, Rosa among them. They described the sounds and the staggered sequence and how the man had cradled a child's head. Their woes were steady, small things that added up. A local forum that had first circulated the edited clip issued a correction. The security firm sent a letter acknowledging they had reacted too quickly. Headlines softened into something more precise. Raw footage reveals man's protective act at holiday market. When the interviews began, Evan spoke without melodrama.
He said what had always felt necessary. "I saw a child in danger. I moved. That's it." He did not ask for medals, but honors and offers came anyway. Calls from a neighborhood council asking if he would lead volunteer training, an offer from a health clinic to handle his immediate care, and a small foundation that wanted to help with any legal fees that might follow. The city, as it often does, corrected what it could and moved on. For Evan, The useful thing was the repair of daily life, the prospect of work that would let him pay rent, and perhaps keep the small rituals that tethered him to the idea of being a father. It was Lila who, after consulting privately with her team, used her resources to do something more. She tasked an aide with discreetly locating the boy's current contact information. She did not promise miracles or make legal threats. She simply asked to be of help in reconnecting a family that had been fragmented. The aide, working with care and a sense of discretion, found a listing that linked Noah to a guardian's address at a suburban block 3 towns over. The papers were not public, and the path was not intrusive. It was simply the use of means to bridge a distance. Simultaneously, a quieter channel opened. Noah, now taller and with an adolescent's careful face, had seen an old photograph he kept in the back of a drawer and wondered at the name on the back. He'd been scrolling through a community group when Arya's short clip turned up. 2 sentences, a child's voice, and the unedited frame that finally made sense. He watched all the clips, the raw footage, the statements. He did not feel the sudden warmth of a reunion, but something like recognition threaded through him. He texted a simple, guarded message to a number he found buried in an old address book. "Is this you?" Evan's phone lit at a quiet hour with a message that made the breath lift from his chest before he could think properly. A short string of words and the suspicion of a face. He read it at the kitchen table, the kettle long cooled. His hands hummed with nerves he had not felt in a decade. He typed back with the clumsy care of a man who had rehearsed 1,000 times behind closed doors. "It's me," he wrote. "If you want to talk, I'm here." Noah's reply was cautious. The next few messages were small and measured. No dramatic bursts, no tears delivered for cameras. He wrote that he had watched the footage, that he had a lot of questions, and that maybe he could meet somewhere public. They agreed on the community center near the pond, a place Evan had once brought Noah to feed ducks and throw small pebbles into winter dark water. The days leading up to the meeting folded into a strange, old-new tension. Evan took the jacket to the cleaners, as if a clean sleeve might buy him steadiness. He practiced not speaking too fast. He thought about what 10 years had done, the sanded edges, the slow formation of a new life, and the particular ache of missed birthdays. He did not promise the moon. He promised punctuality and presence, the thing his absence had failed to guarantee. On the appointed afternoon, the community center glittered with lights for an early tree lighting. Families clustered, children carried handmade paper stars, and volunteers handed out hot cocoa in small paper cups. The whole scene was intentionally ordinary. Carols hummed through the foyer, and a felt Santa posed on a low stage. Evan waited with his hands folded around a warm cup, watching as people passed. He saw Noah before Noah saw him, taller, shoulders squared like a young man trying to balance curiosity and wariness. The boy's hair had a similar set to the photo Evan had kept for 10 years. For a second, Evan could have wept from the simple mercy of that resemblance. Noah's approach was not cinematic. It was hesitant, precise. He held his gaze down for a moment and then raised it. "Hi," he said, and Dad did not spring from his mouth like a practiced line. It came later, as if the word itself had to be tested on the tongue. "Hi," Evan answered, feeling his voice small and real. What followed was an hour that could have been written as a scene of instant healing, but instead honored the truth. Stilted sentences, awkward pauses, questions about the years apart. Noah asked about mundane things, why his father had missed soccer games, whether he'd come to some birthdays, and about the bigger, shadowed parts, where he'd been, why it had been so hard. Evan answered with a careful honesty that had cost him practice. He named what he felt able to name without casting blame across absent shoulders. He said simply that he had carried regret every day and that his greatest mistake had been letting distance become a wall. There were moments when Noah's face hardened, teenagers keep some armor, and moments when something small and unguarded slipped through, a recognition of the man who had once taught him to skip stones, or who had hummed bad little songs to make him laugh. At one point, Noah reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the creases. He unfolded it and handed it to Evan, a drawing, much like the one taped to Evan's door, only more careful now, with a stick figure labeled Dad and another smaller one marked Noah. Evan's throat closed. This small, imperfect exchange, no cinematic, tearful embrace at first, only the passing of a child's drawing back into a father's hand, felt like permission to continue. They did not solve 10 years in an hour. They left the conversation with plans that felt concrete. Weekly dinners when schedules allowed, a phone call every other night, steps toward addressing the paperwork that had kept them apart, and the cautious promise of attending a Christmas service together.
Noah did not say forgive me in a way that demanded absolution, nor did Evan demand either.
But when a passing child barreled into Evan and nearly toppled their cocoa cups, Noah's hand waved off the boy's apology with a half smile, a small human kindness that felt, to Evan, like a beginning. In the weeks that followed, restitution took practical forms. Lila's team wired funds to cover the market's vendor damages and offered to help Evan secure a modest apartment closer to his new work route. The health clinic cleared his immediate bills. The security firm, chastened by public scrutiny, offered a formal apology and a small settlement that allowed him to close the question of lost wages. Lila's company made an offer on paper for a supervisory role that would let him work regular hours and save. When she handed him the job letter in person, she said simply, "We believe in responsibility. We also believe in giving people the chance to rebuild." Evan accepted with hesitancy and gratitude. He framed it as work earned and not as charity. To him, the job was a lifeline and a promise, an opportunity to be both steady and valued. He thought of the jacket, still mended in a dozen places, and how it had been a talisman through lonely winters. Now he had keys to a small apartment, and, more importantly, a set of days that could be counted on. That morning, Lila's aide handed him a small envelope with a key and a note. "Welcome home." Christmas arrived in a flurry of small, cold miracles. The community tree's lights blinked like patient stars. The church hall overflowed with an array of humble offerings: hot cider, forest scent, the faint echo of carols rehearsed not for perfection, but for warmth. Evan hung back with a thermos in his hand, Noah beside him, eyes taking in the crowd with an adolescent's quick assessment. They moved together through the crowd, neither claiming ownership nor avoiding each other entirely. Lila watched from a distance, her daughter Aria at her side, both of them part of the small constellation of people who had helped nudge the reunion forward. She had become, in a way, a bridge between different lives, a wealthy woman's power used in the quiet service of what was right. The crowd applauded a moment later when a volunteer read a short letter about ordinary acts of courage. The applause was for a dozen